slammed heard across the world. And Ibsen, later on, there was a group of women, I can't remember exactly the context, but they were thanking him for what he did for women's rights. And he said he wasn't even thinking about women's rights, he was only thinking about human rights. If you think about what Nora did, she took out a loan, and that was against the law for her to do that by herself. And I just kind of had this epiphany while I was thinking about it today. That sounds like something you would say to a child. Like, you're not old enough to take out a loan. You're not responsible enough. You can't make your own decision. And if you think about that, in terms of voting, it's kind of the same thing. You have to be 18 to vote. So not only were women just seen as inferior, but I think they really thought that women were just frivolous and wouldn't know what to do with some kind of crisis without a man, or and they go through all sorts of things without men, and just dealing with everything that you have to deal with as a parent. It takes a lot of critical thinking for that too. So that just kind of puts it in perspective. And so, of course, Nora is going to question this law, and she's also questioning, well, what's moral? You notice that the women in the play, when they question morality, it has a lot more to do with their the livelihood, the life of their family, in securing that. When the men in the play talk about it, it's usually addressed with the idea of the law. Okay, and so I was thinking about that too, and I thought, well, maybe that's because women had very little to do with the law, and so that's not how they're thinking. But this is very much a patriarchal society, right? And the idea is that you have this structure and tradition, and if you don't, then all these other things can happen. So, but when something does happen, that's like, okay, you get sick and you get in a situation where you have to have the money, and Nora makes a choice to do something that is kind of like civil disobedience, something that is against the law, but is it not more important to save someone's life? And this is what's kind of tragic about the character of Torvald. He's not a great character because there's not a whole lot of substance to him, except for the fact that he doesn't really see himself outside of what society sees him as. He's very defined by that. And Nora questions it. Okay, so if I asked, again, if this was a class, my first question as a teacher would be to ask you what you think of Nora, just as a personality. How would you describe her? And what people typically say when they're in their first reading is that she seems kind of shallow and materialistic. And that's true in a way, because that's how Ibsen is characterizing her. He's showing her as being kind of frivolous. And so he's setting you up for this. But the thing about the genius of this play is all in the subtleties, in the things that you don't really expect. And that's why I think a lot of it is ironic. And I would use that if we were looking at the chart of, okay, so we're looking at ambiguous characters, and then we're looking at some kind of literary element to get us there with a play, irony. and you know dramatic irony probably from Romeo and Juliet. Remember when the audience knows, you know it's going to happen. You know she's not really dead and she's going to wake up and it's like, don't do this. That is the use of irony is typically used in plays, and then also character foils is a good direction to go too. So when, you know, he comes in, the other question is, well, how do you think he treats her? And people will typically say, I think he's really nice. He seems to be a loving husband. He calls her his lark and little spendthrift. And after kind of going over it a little bit and sometimes reading it out loud, you start to see, well, maybe it's a little bit belittling to her. And he's treating her then like a child, which is, if you think about what I said about, well, why can't a woman take out a loan? What's wrong with that? So one of the subtle things, though, that he says when she asks for money, he says that I would give you money if you would really buy something for yourself. But you'll just spend it on housekeeping and other things. So it's a little subtle indication that she's a selfless person, even though on the surface, and this isn't an accident, is seen to be kind of silly and frivolous, but at the core, she's not. And that is what makes her ambiguous, you know. And okay, so you have that, and then you meet Linda comes over, and Linda is like a character foil to Nora. She's really there as a contrast. And if you start looking at characters that way, you'll see that they're character foils. If you remember ever, you know, discussing this with an English teacher, the foil exemplifies your characteristics. It's kind of like if you've got a best friend and you're opposite, and one of you is really outgoing and loud and the other one is really quiet. Well, when that person is around, it exemplifies your characteristics. And sometimes it's almost like an inside joke between you two, because and other people who are close to you can see it and recognize it. So by contrast, as serious as Linda, and she seems to be someone who's had a much harder life, you know, and Nora's just kind of like eating the macaroons and dancing around and like life is a party. And then as a contrast, she comes in and she's had this terrible time and she needs a job. And of course, again, Nora is right there willing to help her, and she's excited about it. So she immediately knows that she can do something about this. And anytime she feels like she's got just, I don't know, a little bit of say in something, in a situation, she feels empowered. And so she immediately, and the kind of funny thing is, though, all she's got to do is flirt a little bit with her husband, and he'll give in. So it's kind of showing the sex struggle, the power struggle, because I guess if there's one area that men are going to be weak in with their wife or whoever, it's going to be that. And if you read the stage directions, there's a lot of physical actions, reactions, and flirtations. And I think that is part of the power struggle. And that's what I at least write about, if I was trying to make it interesting. Okay, so Linda comes in, and then you also meet Dr. Rank, which is also interesting because just think of his name, Rank. And once they start talking, she kind of really lets herself go with Dr. Rank, and I'll get into that in Act 2 when that's, I don't want to go there right now, but you should pay attention to that relationship. And there's also kind of a funny line where he's a doctor, and going back to the irony, he's a doctor, but he's the one dying in the play. And you know, he meets Linda, and he's also gets kind of jealous of her because he realizes that she will be the one who replaces him. And so she says something about how she had to come back to look for work, and he says, "Is that a good cure for overwork?" Because she had just said she was overworked. And she says, "One must live." And he says, "Yes, that's the general opinion. It seems to be that it's necessary. Yes, the general opinion seems to be that it's necessary." And this is where you kind of get what's going on with him, because Nora says, "Dr. Frank, you know you want to live." And he says, "Certainly. However wretched I may feel, I want to prolong the agony as long as possible. All my patients are like that." And so it's very ironic humor. And so are the ones who are morally diseased. And he starts to talk about Krogstad. And he's talking about him being morally diseased. Krogstad is also an interesting character because I think a lot of people assume he's just a villain. But once you get into the story, you realize that he has children, and he did something that Nora did as well, and was, you know, his reputation. And back then, I mean, your reputation was everything. You can see that through the text, that was really important. But you have to kind of wonder, is, you know, he's trying to survive too. Because he'll ask Nora at one point, "Did you and your husband think about my children?" And usually you don't have that, you know, aspect of the villain where you see there's a human connection there. So even he's ambiguous. There's nothing that's, you know, black or right or wrong, and that's kind of the point that he's making about morality. Like I said, how would you define it? How do we define it? Why do we just say it's the rule? This is the rules. Sometimes rules have to be broken. So rising action starts to pick up a little bit, and you see Krogstad comes in, and he's just lost his position. Now remember, Linda just gains a position, and then of course the two have a history. So it's ironic. There's a lot of contrast. And he's the one that knows about. He was the one that finds out about her forging her dad's signature for the loan, and he uses this to blackmail her. So it seems, like I said before, like a villain, but you kind of find out later that, and he also kind of changes too, you know, in the play, which doesn't normally happen with a villain, right?